James Carter, 52, leaned back in the driver's seat of his sleek black sedan, the engine humming softly as he navigated the winding roads of Willow Creek, Georgia. The early November dawn painted the sky in hues of soft pink and gold, and the air carried a crisp chill that reminded him of his childhood in Chicago's South Side. Back then, he'd walk to school through frost-covered streets, his mother's voice in his head, "Keep your head up, James, but don't draw eyes you don't need." Those words had guided him through decades of military service, from dusty battlefields in Iraq to the polished halls of the Pentagon, where he now served as a lieutenant general overseeing strategic operations. But today, he was just a son, driving back from visiting his mother, Evelyn, who still lived in the modest brick house where she'd raised him alone, stitching together a life as a nurse while fending off the world's sharp edges. The car's interior was simple, uncluttered. On the passenger seat sat a worn leather satchel, holding a few groceries, canned peaches, a loaf of rye bread, and a pint of milk for his mother's morning tea. Beside it lay a small Bible, its edges frayed from years of Evelyn's nightly readings, and a knitted scarf she'd made during one of her quieter winters. James glanced at it, a faint smile tugging at his lips. At 52, he was a man of few words, his broad shoulders and steady gaze shaped by years of command and the weight of proving himself in a world that often saw his skin before his stars. Growing up, he'd been stopped by police more times than he could count, each encounter a lesson in restraint. One night at 16, an officer had pinned him against a fence for looking suspicious, near his own home, the humiliation burning deeper than the cold. That moment had pushed him to the army, where he thought discipline and rank might shield him from such indignities. He'd been wrong, but he'd learned to carry that truth quietly. Willow Creek was still waking up as he drove past the old gas station, its neon sign flickering with faded letters. The town was small, its main street lined with mom-and-pop shops and a diner that still served peach cobbler like it was 1955. James blended in, his dark jacket and jeans unremarkable, his presence as ordinary as the morning mist. He'd been back in Georgia for only a year, stationed nearby after decades away, and he liked the rhythm of these quiet drives. No music played, the silence was enough, broken only by the occasional glance in the rearview mirror, a soldier's habit, never fully shed. Then, just before the turn into the residential area, a white and blue patrol car pulled out from a side street, its lights flashing briefly before settling into a slow cruise ahead of him. James's jaw tightened, but his hand stayed steady at 10 and 2 on the wheel. He'd seen this before, too many times. The patrol car slowed, then veered sharply to block his path. He eased onto the brake, his heart rate steady but his mind racing back to that Chicago alley, to the countless reports he'd read of black men stopped for no reason other than existing. He exhaled slowly, willing his body to stay calm. The driver's side door of the patrol car opened, and Sergeant Michael Walsh, 34, stepped out. His hand rested on his belt, his eyes sharp with a suspicion that seemed to predate the moment. Walsh had grown up in a nearby town, raised by a sheriff father who preached that order came from control. He'd joined the force to carry on that legacy, his broad frame and stern demeanor earning him respect among rookies like Officer Daniel Hayes, who now exited the passenger side. Hayes, 28, was newer, his eagerness to prove himself tinged with an insecurity that made him lean too heavily on Walsh's lead. His father had been a mechanic, not a cop, and Daniel had always felt the need to measure up, to show he belonged in the uniform. "Morning," Walsh said, his voice flat but heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. He tapped James's window, motioning for it to be lowered. James complied, his movements slow and deliberate. "Where you headed this early?" Walsh asked, his eyes scanning the car's interior, lingering on the satchel. "Home," James replied evenly, his voice low but clear. "Just picked up some things for my mom." Walsh's gaze flicked to the Bible, then back to James. "This your car?" "Yes, sir," James said, his tone neither defiant nor submissive. He'd learned long ago that every word, every glance, could be a spark in moments like these. His military ID and firearm permit were in his wallet, but he kept his hands on the wheel, knowing better than to reach without being asked. Hayes stepped closer, his posture tense, almost eager. "License," he said, the word clipped. James nodded, moving slowly to retrieve it. Walsh took the ID, his eyes narrowing at the name, James E. Carter, Virginia address. He glanced at Hayes, who was already checking the plates. "Maryland plates," Hayes called out, his voice loud enough to carry across the quiet street. "Doesn't add up." James's chest tightened, but his face remained unreadable. He'd faced worse, hostile checkpoints in war zones, split-second decisions with lives on the line, but this was different. This wasn't about what he'd done, it was about who they thought he was. Across the street, Maya Thompson, 40, a schoolteacher with tired eyes and a phone in hand, stood at the bus stop. She'd lost her cousin to a police shooting years ago, a wound that never fully healed. Her hands trembled slightly as she began recording, her instinct to document outweighing her fear. Nearby, Ethan Parker, 14, pulled out his phone too, his heart racing with the thrill of capturing something real, something that might matter. "Step out," Walsh ordered, his tone sharper now. James complied, his movements measured, each step a reminder of the discipline that had carried him through decades of service. He stood tall, arms relaxed but ready, his eyes meeting Walsh's without challenge. The morning air felt heavier now, the weight of history pressing down on a quiet Georgia road. James Carter stood by his car, the cold pavement beneath his boots grounding him as Sergeant Michael Walsh's hand pressed against his shoulder, guiding him toward the hood. The metal was still damp with morning dew, and it sent a chill through James's jacket as his chest met the surface. He kept his eyes forward, fixed on the horizon where the sun was climbing, casting long shadows of the three men onto the asphalt. Officer Daniel Hayes rifled through the satchel, spilling the canned peaches and milk onto the back seat. The scarf, Evelyn's handiwork, caught on his boot, and he kicked it aside without a glance. James's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He'd learned in his youth that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford in moments like these. "Who are you, really?" Walsh asked, his voice laced with a mix of suspicion and mockery. He held James's license, flipping it over as if the card itself might confess to a crime. "Driving a car like this, out-of-state plates, no uniform. You some kind of drifter?" James's breath was steady, his military training a quiet anchor. "James Carter," he said simply, his voice calm but firm, the kind that carried authority without raising its pitch. "Just retired, heading home." Hayes smirked, picking up the Bible and flipping through its pages as if it held secrets. "Retired, huh? From what? Joyriding?" He laughed, looking to Walsh for approval. Walsh didn't laugh, but his eyes narrowed, searching James's face for a crack in his composure. He wouldn't find one. James had faced interrogations in war zones, stood before generals who questioned his every move as a black officer rising through the ranks. Each time, he'd held his ground, not with defiance but with the quiet strength of a man who knew his worth. Walsh's radio crackled as he stepped back, speaking low. "Requesting backup. Suspicious male, black, approximately 50, out-of-state vehicle, possible forged documents." The words hit James like a punch he'd seen coming. He'd read reports of this, hundreds of them, during his time at the Pentagon, cases where "suspicious" was code for "doesn't look like us." But standing here, feeling the cuffs snap around his wrists, the weight was different. It wasn't just policy now, it was personal, a reminder of the Chicago cop who'd once told a teenage James, "You don't belong here, boy." Across the street, Maya Thompson's hand steadied as she recorded, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. She'd promised herself after her cousin's death that she'd never stay silent again. Her cousin, Marcus, had been 22, shot during a routine stop that was anything but routine. The memory fueled her now, her phone capturing every detail, the way Walsh's hand lingered on his holster, the way Hayes tossed James's belongings like they were trash. Beside her, Ethan Parker, the 14-year-old with a knack for tech, zoomed in on James's face, struck by the man's stillness. Ethan had grown up watching YouTube videos of protests, his mixed-race heritage making him hyper-aware of the world's fault lines. He wanted this video to matter, to be more than just another post. "Got a gun," Hayes said suddenly, pulling James's registered firearm from his waistband. He held it up like a trophy, his voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "This ain't for civilians." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with implication. James's eyes flicked to the weapon, then back to the horizon. He'd carried that gun legally for years, a necessity for a high-ranking officer with classified responsibilities. But he knew explaining that now would be pointless. To them, it was just another reason to see him as a threat. Walsh stepped closer, his face inches from James's. "You know how to stay quiet, don't you? Waiting for someone to bail you out?" The words were meant to provoke, to draw out anger or fear. James gave him neither. His silence wasn't submission, it was strategy, honed over decades of navigating spaces where his presence was questioned. He thought of his mother, Evelyn, who'd taught him to hold his head high but keep his words few. He thought of the soldiers he'd led, who trusted his calm under fire. This wasn't a battlefield, but it felt like one. Maya's hands shook now, not from fear but from anger. She wanted to shout, to demand they stop, but she knew her voice would only escalate things. Her video was her weapon, her way of bearing witness. Ethan, too, felt the weight of the moment, his phone steady as he captured Walsh's smirk, Hayes's restless energy. A small crowd was forming, shopkeepers, passers-by, a delivery driver pausing his route. No one spoke, but their eyes were locked on the scene, some pulling out phones, others whispering. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes just before something breaks. James's mind stayed clear, his training kicking in. He knew one wrong move could turn this into a tragedy, and he refused to give them that excuse. His eyes met Maya's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. He saw Ethan, too, the boy's young face set with determination. James didn't need their pity, he needed their eyes, their proof. He took a slow breath, his voice low but steady. "I'd like to make a call." Walsh laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Calling your lawyer? Or your mom?" He nodded to Hayes, who stepped forward, ready to confiscate the phone. But James's gaze held Walsh's, unyielding, the look of a man who'd faced down worse and come out whole. "One call," he repeated, each word deliberate, like a command issued in a war room. The morning light caught the faint scar on his knuckles, a reminder of a long-ago fight he'd walked away from. This time, he'd walk away too, but not without leaving a mark. James Carter stood against the hood of his car, the cuffs biting into his wrists as the Georgia morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the quiet street. Sergeant Michael Walsh held James's phone now, having snatched it from his hand just as he'd begun to dial. The screen was still lit, the call still active, and a voice crackled through the speaker, clear and commanding. "This is Colonel Harris, Pentagon Strategic Command. Do not interfere with General Carter's equipment." The words landed like a grenade, freezing Walsh mid-step. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of doubt that he tried to mask with a quick glance at Officer Daniel Hayes. James remained still, his eyes fixed on a distant point, his face a mask of calm forged through years of high-stakes decisions. He'd earned that composure in places like Fallujah, where one wrong word could cost lives, and in Pentagon briefings, where his race often made his rank feel like a borrowed title. Growing up in Chicago, he'd learned to navigate suspicion early, cops circling his block, teachers doubting his potential. Each time, he'd proven them wrong, not with anger but with results. Now, standing here, he felt the weight of those lessons, the sting of knowing that decades of service hadn't erased the assumptions etched into Walsh's and Hayes's eyes. "Who you calling, huh? Some big shot?" Walsh said, his voice sharper now, trying to reclaim control. He held the phone like it might burn him, his thumb hovering over the end call button. But the voice on the other end continued, steady and unyielding. "General Carter, confirm your location." James spoke, his words precise, cutting through the morning air. "Willow Creek, Monroe County, Georgia. Alpha Shadow 1. I'm being detained, no stated cause. Firearm confiscated, badge searched." His tone was emotionless, a soldier reporting facts, but beneath it lay a quiet fury, not at the officers, but at the system that let them think this was routine. Across the street, Maya Thompson's phone trembled in her hands, but she kept recording, her heart racing with a mix of fear and defiance. Her cousin Marcus's face flashed in her mind, his smile, his dreams, snuffed out by a bullet during a routine stop. She'd vowed to never let another injustice go unseen, and now her footage captured every detail: Walsh's tense posture, Hayes's nervous fidgeting, the crowd growing larger. Ethan Parker, the 14-year-old beside her, zoomed in on James's face, struck by the man's stillness. Ethan had seen videos like this online, but being here, witnessing it, felt different. His hands were steady, driven by a need to make this moment count, to show the world what he saw. The voice on the phone spoke again, sharp and final. "Stand by, General. Response team dispatched. Do not engage." The call ended with a click, and the silence that followed was heavier than any siren. Walsh's face paled, his hand loosening around the phone. He set it on the hood, his movements slow, as if it might explode. Hayes looked to him for guidance, his earlier bravado crumbling. "Sarge, what's that mean?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves in the breeze. James didn't move, didn't speak. He didn't need to. The officers' confidence was unraveling, their authority slipping like sand through their fingers. Walsh's eyes darted to the crowd, now a dozen strong, phones raised, capturing every second. Maya's lens caught the moment Walsh's hand twitched toward his radio, then stopped. She knew that look, fear masquerading as control. She'd seen it in the officers who dismissed her cousin's death as unfortunate. Ethan, too, felt the shift, his heart pounding as he realized this wasn't just a stop, it was a reckoning. The distant hum of engines broke the silence, growing louder, more insistent. Two black SUVs, unmarked but unmistakably military, roared into view, their tires screeching as they stopped just meters from James's car. The doors opened, and three men in dark tactical gear stepped out, their movements precise, their presence shrinking the scene to a single point of tension. The lead, a wiry man with a face like carved stone, held up a badge that glinted in the sunlight. "Department of Defense, Strategic Command," he said, his voice low but cutting. "Release General Carter immediately." Walsh's hand froze on his belt, his bravado gone. Hayes stepped back, his eyes wide, the firearm still in his hand now feeling like a liability. The crowd murmured, phones still rolling, capturing the moment the officers realized they'd misjudged everything. James stood straighter, his cuffs still on, his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to say he was a general, the truth was doing the talking now, and it was louder than any shout. The black SUVs loomed like sentinels on the quiet Willow Creek street, their engines idling with a low, menacing hum. James Carter stood handcuffed against his car, the metal cuffs digging into his wrists, but his posture remained unbroken, his eyes fixed on the military team now facing Sergeant Michael Walsh and Officer Daniel Hayes. The lead operative, Colonel Marcus Reed, held a badge that gleamed with authority, its etched letters spelling out Department of Defense, Strategic Command. His voice was calm but unyielding, each word a command. "Release General Carter. Now." Walsh's face twitched, a mix of defiance and panic. He'd grown up idolizing his father, a sheriff who'd ruled their small Georgia town with an iron fist, teaching Michael that control was the key to respect. But now, that control was slipping, challenged by a force he couldn't intimidate. He glanced at Hayes, who was clutching James's firearm, his hands trembling. Hayes, desperate to prove himself to Walsh, had always leaned into aggression to mask his doubts. Now, those doubts were all he felt, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Reed's presence. "Procedure," Walsh stammered, his voice thinner than before. "We haven't verified his identity. No military plates, no uniform. We're just doing our job." Reed's eyes didn't waver. "The Pentagon verified him 10 minutes ago. You're holding a lieutenant general. Step back." The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a system far beyond Willow Creek's jurisdiction. Walsh hesitated, then nodded to Hayes, who fumbled with the cuffs, his fingers clumsy as he unlocked them. The metal clicked open, and James rubbed his wrists, the faint red marks a quiet testament to the morning's indignity. He didn't look at the officers, didn't demand an apology. Instead, he bent down, picking up his scratched military badge from the pavement, its surface marred from the rough search. Across the street, Maya Thompson's phone captured every second, her heart pounding with a mix of triumph and sorrow. She'd seen this before, her cousin Marcus, cuffed and pleading, with no one to intervene. But today was different. Today, the system had answered back. Ethan Parker, the 14-year-old beside her, zoomed in on James's face, struck by the man's silence. Ethan's parents had taught him to question authority, to see the world through the lens of their mixed-race family struggles. Now, he felt like he was part of something bigger, his video a piece of history unfolding. The crowd had grown, shopkeepers and passers-by forming a loose semicircle, their phones raised like silent witnesses. A delivery driver, still in his uniform, whispered to a woman nearby, "That's a general?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but heavy. James stepped toward his car, his movements deliberate, each step a reclaiming of the dignity Walsh and Hayes had tried to strip away. Reed and his team flanked him, not as escorts but as equals, their presence a silent rebuke to the officer's actions. Walsh's radio crackled again, but he didn't answer it. His face was pale, his earlier confidence replaced by a dawning realization. He'd followed his father's playbook, act first, justify later, but this time, he'd miscalculated. Hayes, still holding the firearm, set it on the hood, his hands shaking. "We didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. But the word sounded hollow, even to him. He'd wanted to impress Walsh, to prove he belonged in the uniform, but now he saw the cost of that ambition. James picked up his badge, wiping the dust off with his sleeve. The scratch across its surface caught the light, a permanent mark of the morning's wrong. He slipped it into his pocket, his eyes meeting Reed's for a brief moment. No words were needed, they'd served together years ago, Reed a young captain under James's command in Afghanistan. Back then, James had taught him that true leadership was about restraint, not reaction. Today, that lesson stood tall. Maya lowered her phone, her hands steady now. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, not for James but for Marcus, for all the others who never got a call answered. Ethan, too, stopped recording, his young face set with purpose. He'd post the video later, knowing it would spread, knowing it would matter. The crowd began to disperse, but their silence lingered, a collective breath held as they realized what they'd witnessed, not just a man freed, but a system forced to confront itself. James opened his car door, the groceries still scattered in the back. He glanced at the scarf, now dirt-streaked, and felt a pang for his mother, who'd never know the full weight of this morning. As he slid into the driver's seat, Reed leaned in, his voice low. "That scratch stays, sir. It's part of the record now." James nodded, his face unreadable. The SUVs pulled away, and James followed, leaving Walsh and Hayes standing alone on the empty street, their uniforms suddenly feeling too heavy for the truth they now had to face. By noon, Willow Creek was no longer just a sleepy Georgia town. The video Maya Thompson had recorded was uploaded to social media, spreading faster than the morning mist could lift. Ethan Parker's footage, posted to his small YouTube channel, gained traction too, the hashtag #AlphaShadow1 trending within hours. The clips showed James Carter, calm and handcuffed, his voice steady as he made his call, followed by the dramatic arrival of the military SUVs. Comments flooded in, "This is why we can't trust the system, he's a general, and they still did this?" The outrage was palpable, a raw nerve exposed across the country. James drove home, the quiet of his car a stark contrast to the storm brewing online. He didn't check his phone, didn't need to. He'd seen this before, incidents that sparked fury, only to fade when the cameras turned away. But this felt different. The weight of his badge, scratched and heavy in his pocket, reminded him of the Chicago nights when he'd vowed to rise above the assumptions that dogged him. He'd joined the army to prove he was more than what others saw, but today, he'd been reduced to a suspect again. The irony wasn't lost on him, but neither was the resolve that had carried him through. At the Monroe County Police Department, Chief Laura Bennett sat in her office, the blinds drawn against the midday sun. She'd been a reformer, pushing for de-escalation training and community outreach since taking the job 5 years ago. A woman in a male-dominated field, she'd fought her own battles, proving her worth through grit and results. But now, her department was under fire, and she felt the weight of her own ideals crashing against reality. She'd known Walsh, respected his experience, but his actions today, driven by the same tough-on-crime mindset his father had drilled into him, had betrayed everything she'd worked for. Laura called an emergency meeting, her voice tight as she addressed the officers involved. The room was small, the air thick with tension. Walsh stood by the door, his face set, while Hayes sat hunched, avoiding her gaze. "I want answers," Laura said, her eyes scanning the room. Why was he stopped? No traffic violation, no warrant. So why? No one spoke. Walsh's silence was defiant, Hayes's nervous. Laura played Maya's video on a wall-mounted screen, freezing it at the moment Walsh cuffed James. "This," she said, "is what happens when you see skin before facts." The truth hung heavy. Walsh had grown up believing order meant control, a lesson from his father's days as sheriff. Hayes, eager to prove himself, had followed Walsh's lead, his insecurities pushing him to act first, think later. Laura saw it now, their actions weren't a mistake but a symptom of a deeper rot, one she'd tried to uproot but hadn't fully faced. She thought of her own early days, the slurs she'd ignored to fit in, the compromises she'd made to climb the ranks. This wasn't just about Walsh and Hayes, it was about a system she'd helped uphold. Online, the video was inescapable. News outlets picked it up, anchors dissecting the footage with a mix of shock and grim familiarity. A retired officer, Thomas Reed, appeared on a local station, his voice heavy with regret. He recounted a 1980s incident where a black doctor was beaten during a stop, left to die without justice. "I stayed silent then," he said, his eyes red. "I won't now." His confession hit like a spark, igniting debates about silence and complicity. Maya, watching at home, felt a knot in her chest loosen. Her cousin Marcus hadn't gotten this attention, but maybe James's story would keep others from his fate. Ethan, too, saw the impact of his video. His parents, proud but worried, sat him down to talk about the risks of posting. "You did the right thing," his mother said, her voice soft. "But be ready for what comes next." Ethan nodded, his young mind grappling with the power of his phone, the weight of being a witness. He thought of James's calm, the way he'd stood tall despite the cuffs, and felt a spark of purpose. He wanted to be that kind of strong, the kind that didn't need to shout. By evening, the story had reached national news, the question echoing across broadcasts: if he wasn't a general, would we know? James sat in his mother's kitchen, the scarf now cleaned and folded beside him. Evelyn, 78, sipped her tea, her eyes sharp despite her age. "They didn't see you, James," she said softly. "They never do." He nodded, the weight of her words settling deep. He didn't want this fight, but he knew it wasn't just his. It was for Marcus, for Ethan, for every name forgotten. And as the world watched, James Carter knew the real battle was just beginning. The Southern District Federal Court of Georgia was a hive of activity, its marble halls echoing with the hum of reporters and the click of cameras. The trial of Sergeant Michael Walsh and Officer Daniel Hayes was no quiet affair. It was live-streamed, a public spectacle demanded by the Department of Defense and the Attorney General's office. James Carter's arrest had become a national flashpoint, and the courtroom was the stage where truth would face the system head-on. The indictment, a hefty 50 pages, charged Walsh and Hayes with organized abuse of authority, unlawful use of force, and interference with a classified military device. Each word was a brick in a wall of accountability, built to withstand the excuses that had shielded such actions for too long. James Carter didn't attend. He sat in his mother's living room in Willow Creek, the TV off, the quiet of the house a refuge from the storm. He'd seen enough courtrooms, enough battles, to know his presence wasn't needed to make the point. His silence during the arrest had spoken louder than any testimony could. He thought of his early days in Chicago, the way his mother, Evelyn, had worked double shifts to keep him in school, the way he'd dodged gangs and cops alike to make it to the army. Every step had been a fight against assumptions, and now, at 52, he was still fighting, not for himself, but for the truth to be seen. In the courtroom, the lead prosecutor, Maria Alvarez, a Dominican-American woman with a reputation for precision, stood before the jury. Her voice was steady, her words cutting. "This wasn't a mistake," she said, gesturing to the screen where Maya Thompson's video played. "This was a crime, cloaked in a badge." The footage showed James, calm and cuffed, his voice steady as he made his call, "Alpha Shadow 1. I'm being detained." The jury, a mix of ages and races, watched in silence as the military SUVs arrived, the officers' faces shifting from arrogance to fear. Alvarez paused the video. They didn't stop General Carter because of what he did. They stopped him because of who they thought he was. Walsh sat at the defense table, his face rigid, his hands clasped tightly. He'd believed in his father's mantra, control the street, control the outcome. But now, that belief was unraveling, exposed as a reflex rooted in bias. Hayes, beside him, looked smaller, his eyes darting to the gallery where reporters scribbled notes. He'd wanted to be like Walsh, to earn respect through action, but now he saw the cost, a career in ruins, a town watching, a nation judging. Their defense attorney argued procedure, claiming the officers acted on reasonable suspicion, but the words sounded hollow against the weight of the evidence: satellite footage, military logs, James's encrypted call. Maya Thompson sat in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap. She'd been called as a witness, her video the cornerstone of the case. Testifying had been hard, reliving her cousin's death through every frame she'd captured. But as she spoke, her voice grew stronger, fueled by the memory of Marcus and the hope that this trial might mean something for others. Ethan Parker wasn't there, his parents had kept him home, worried about the spotlight. But his video was played too, its shaky zoom on James's face a testament to a boy's instinct to act when adults hesitated. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. The judge, a black woman whose own father had been a civil rights attorney, read the sentencing with a steady voice. "Sergeant Walsh and Officer Hayes, you undermined the law you swore to uphold. This court sentences you to dismissal from service and prohibits you from holding any law enforcement position again." The room was silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. For Walsh, it was the end of a legacy he'd thought untouchable. For Hayes, it was a lesson he'd never unlearn. Outside, the crowd was quiet, not cheering but reflecting. Maya stepped into the sunlight, her heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. She thought of Marcus, of the justice he'd never gotten. Ethan, watching the news at home, felt a surge of pride but also fear. Would his video change anything, or would it just be another moment lost to time? In Willow Creek, Chief Laura Bennett watched the verdict from her office, her reform plans now a mandate. She knew the real work was just beginning, not just for her department, but for a system that had let bias fester too long. James, still at his mother's, picked up the scarf from the table, its thread soft under his fingers. He didn't need to see the verdict to know what it meant. It wasn't victory, it was a crack in the armor of a system that had failed too many. And as the world debated his story, he knew the real fight was for those who'd never get a call answered, whose silence would never be heard. The verdict in Willow Creek sent shockwaves beyond Georgia, rippling through newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the country. The term, Carter effect, began to circulate, coined by a sociologist on a late-night talk show. It wasn't about James Carter's rank or his call to the Pentagon, it was about his silence, his refusal to react with anger or defiance, forcing the system to confront its own flaws. That silence became a mirror, reflecting a truth America had long avoided: justice often depended on who you were, not what you did. James stayed out of the spotlight, declining interviews and public appearances. He spent his days in Willow Creek, helping his mother, Evelyn, tend her small garden or sitting on the porch, sipping tea and listening to the stories of neighbors who stopped by. He'd always been a listener, a trait honed in the army, where he'd sat with young soldiers, hearing their fears before a mission. Growing up, he'd listened to his mother's quiet strength, her warnings about a world that judged him before he spoke. Now, that same quiet was reshaping how a nation saw itself. In Washington, D.C., a congressional committee convened to address the reasonable suspicion doctrine, a legal cornerstone that had justified countless stops like James's. Representative Sarah Chen, a young Asian American lawmaker, opened the hearing with a pointed question: how many times has suspicion been a license to profile? The room, packed with lawmakers and experts, fell silent. A retired police chief, Edward Grayson, testified, his voice heavy with regret. "I taught officers to trust their gut," he said. "But I never asked if that gut was shaped by bias." His words echoed James's experience, a reminder of the Chicago cops who'd seen a teenager, not a future general. The hearing produced a draft bill, the National Enforcement Integrity Act, proposing that stops based on racial bias be treated as federal crimes, not administrative errors. It was a seismic shift, met with resistance from some who feared it would hamstring officers. But Chen countered, "We're not asking you to stop protecting, we're asking you to stop assuming." The bill's introduction was televised, and the image of James, handcuffed but unbowed, flashed across screens, a silent argument for change. In Willow Creek, Chief Laura Bennett faced her own reckoning. She'd pushed for reform, but the trial exposed how deeply bias ran in her department. She met with community leaders, including Maya Thompson, who spoke of her cousin's death and the need for accountability. "It's not about punishment," Maya said, her voice steady. "It's about making sure no one else feels like they don't belong." Laura nodded, her resolve hardening. She introduced a new training module, the Carter scenario, where officers faced a citizen doing nothing wrong, forced to question their instincts before acting. Ethan Parker, now a local hero, struggled with the attention. His video had millions of views, but the comments, some praising, some vicious, made him question his role. His parents sat him down, his father saying, "You didn't just record a moment, you gave a voice to the silenced." Ethan thought of James's calm, the way he'd stood tall despite the cuffs. He started a blog, sharing stories of others who'd faced similar stops, hoping to keep the conversation alive. Online, the hashtag AlphaShadow1 hashtag grew, alongside posts of forgotten names, people stopped, beaten, or killed without a general's rank to save them. A retired officer, Thomas Reed, published an open letter, confessing his silence during a 1980s incident that left a black man dead. "I thought I was neutral," he wrote. But silence isn't neutral, it's complicity. His words, read on national news, struck a chord, prompting others to come forward with their own stories of regret. James, pruning roses in his mother's garden, heard about the Carter effect from a neighbor. He shook his head, not in denial but in humility. He didn't want to be a symbol, he wanted the system to change so no one needed to be. Evelyn, watching him, smiled softly. "You didn't shout, James," she said. "But they heard you anyway." He nodded, the scratched badge in his pocket a reminder that some marks don't fade, they teach. In the wake of the trial, police academies across the country began to change. In Quantico, Virginia, the National Police Academy unveiled a new training module, the Carter Scenario. It wasn't about tactics or firepower, it was about ethics, forcing recruits to confront their biases in a controlled setting. Trainees were placed in simulations where they faced a citizen, calm, non-threatening, but racially profiled, challenged to act without prejudice. The question wasn't, what do you do, but, why did you do it? The module's first line, posted on a dark blue board at the Academy's entrance, read, "If no one is watching, do you trust yourself to act justly?" James Carter, now fully retired, stayed far from the spotlight. He'd moved to a small house near Willow Creek's outskirts, a place where red maples turned the yard crimson each fall. He spent his days reading, tending to his mother's garden, and hosting neighbors for tea. He didn't talk about the incident, but his silence spoke through the reforms it had sparked. His childhood in Chicago had taught him to listen, to weigh words carefully. In the Army, he'd learned that true power lay in restraint, a lesson he'd passed to soldiers like Colonel Marcus Reed, who'd led the team that freed him. Now, that lesson was reshaping how officers were trained. At the Quantico Academy, Sergeant Zachary Owens, 27, stood in a simulation room, stripped of his uniform and badge. The scenario was simple: he was a civilian, stopped without cause, bright lights and shouts disorienting him. "Hands up! Why are you here?" an instructor barked. Zachary, who'd patrolled Baltimore's tough streets, felt his pulse race, his confidence unraveling. 5 minutes later, he exited, pale and shaken. "I thought I knew control," he told the class, his voice cracking. "But being doubted, questioned, without reason, it takes away who you are." The room was silent, every trainee understanding that this wasn't just training, it was a mirror to their own instincts. Maya Thompson, now a community advocate, spoke at a local school about her role in the incident. Her voice trembled as she described filming James, the fear of losing another loved one driving her to act. "My cousin didn't get a video," she said, "but James did, and that's why we're here." Her words inspired students, including Ethan Parker, who'd started volunteering at a youth center, teaching kids how to use tech for change. Ethan's video had sparked a movement, but he grappled with its weight, wondering if one clip could outlast the noise of social media. In Willow Creek, Chief Laura Bennett rolled out the Carter Scenario locally, facing resistance from veteran officers like Michael Walsh's old colleagues. They argued it was too soft, that policing needed instinct, not hesitation. But Laura, shaped by her own battles against sexism in the force, stood firm. "Instinct without question is just bias with a badge," she said. She thought of James's calm, the way he'd held his ground without a word, and knew this was the path forward. Her department began auditing past stops, uncovering patterns of profiling that made her stomach turn. Nationwide, the Carter effect took root. In Ohio, a high school teacher used James's story in a civics class, asking students to write about a moment that changed their view of justice. One girl, 16, wrote, "He didn't fight back, but he didn't give up. That's what strength looks like." Her essay spread online, shared by educators as a testament to the power of restraint. At West Point, cadets studied James's case, not as heroism but as a lesson in moral leadership. "If you act on assumption," their instructor said, "you're not leading, you're following fear." James, unaware of his name in textbooks, sat on his porch, sipping tea as the sun set. A neighbor, a young mother, stopped by, thanking him for what he'd started. He shook his head, his voice soft. "I didn't start anything. I just stood still." But as he looked out at the maples, their leaves glowing in the dusk, he knew his silence had sparked something louder than he'd ever intended, a call to see people, not assumptions, and to act with the courage to pause. As the Carter effect reshaped police training and public discourse, a small plaque appeared at the Willow Creek intersection where James Carter had been stopped. Bronze and unassuming, it was fixed to a fence by the street lamp, its inscription simple: "This is where justice was tested and restored by a man who stood still." No name, no ceremony, just words etched in metal, placed by an anonymous resident. The town council, led by Mayor Robert Langley, chose not to remove it, recognizing its quiet power. "Some truths don't need fanfare," Langley said, his own silence during the incident a regret he now carried. James remained in Willow Creek, living quietly with his mother, Evelyn. He'd declined every offer: TV interviews, book deals, even a congressional medal. His childhood had taught him that attention could be a trap, a lesson reinforced by years in the army, where he'd seen heroes made and broken by headlines. He'd joined to escape the confines of Chicago's South Side, to prove he could be more than the troublemaker cops saw in his teenage face. Now, at 52, he wanted only to live simply, to tend his mother's roses and share tea with those who sought his quiet wisdom. The plaque became a destination, not for tourists but for locals, students, retirees, even former officers. Maya Thompson visited often, standing silently with her son, teaching him about her cousin Marcus and the importance of bearing witness. "This is why I filmed," she told him, her voice soft but firm. "So no one can say it didn't happen." Ethan Parker came too, his phone now a tool for documenting community stories, not just incidents. He'd learned from James's calm, from the way one man's restraint could speak louder than a crowd's shouts. Nationwide, the changes continued. The National Enforcement Integrity Act gained traction, its call for accountability over suspicion sparking heated debates. In California, a review board reopened old cases, uncovering stories of Black and Latino men stopped without cause, their names now spoken alongside James's. In Illinois, a new training program, inspired by the Carter scenario, required officers to journal their reactions to simulated stops, confronting their biases head-on. One recruit wrote, "I thought silence meant guilt. Now I see it might be someone holding on to their dignity." At a Virginia military academy, cadets studied James's case, not as a war story but as a lesson in moral courage. A young officer, trained under James years ago, shared a memory. "He told us, don't act until you understand. Power without clarity is destruction." That lesson, once confined to barracks, now echoed in classrooms, challenging a new generation to question their instincts before they acted. In Willow Creek, a park near the intersection was renamed Alpha Shadow Park, its dedication quiet but meaningful. A statue was raised, not of James, but of a man in a plain shirt, hands folded, standing tall. The plaque read, "For those who stood when justice faltered." High school students visited each spring, holding a minute of silence, not for mourning but for reflection. One girl, 17, wrote in her journal, "I used to think justice needed heroes. Now I know it needs people who don't give up, even when they're alone." James visited the park once, at dusk, when no one else was there. He stood before the statue, his mother's scarf in his pocket, the scratched badge in his hand. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He thought of the Chicago boy who dreamed of proving himself, of the soldiers he'd led, of the system that had tried to break him. The badge's scratch caught the fading light, a mark of a moment that had changed more than he'd ever intended. He turned away, leaving the park to its quiet, knowing his legacy wasn't in the statue but in the questions it made people ask. Years after the Willow Creek incident, James Carter's name was no longer just a headline, it was a benchmark, a quiet test for a system learning to see itself. He'd retreated fully from public life, living in his modest house at the edge of town, where the red maples glowed each fall. He spent his days with Evelyn, now frilier but still sharp, sharing stories over tea or tending the roses that lined their yard. He'd never sought the spotlight, never wanted his story to be a symbol. But the world had other plans, and his silence had become a voice that echoed far beyond Georgia. The National Enforcement Integrity Act passed Congress, a hard-fought victory that redefined reasonable suspicion as a standard requiring evidence, not instinct. Police academies nationwide adopted the Carter scenario, training officers to pause, to question their biases before acting. In Ohio, a middle school included James's story in its civics curriculum, asking students to write about a time they stood up for what was right. One boy, 13, wrote, "I learned from Mr. Carter that you don't need to be loud to be strong. You just need to be right." Maya Thompson became a community leader, her video a catalyst for change. She started a nonprofit, teaching youth to document their communities, to give voice to the unseen. Ethan Parker, now in high school, joined her workshops, his tech skills helping others share their stories. He often thought of James's calm, the way he'd stood unbowed, and it drove him to keep recording, to keep asking questions. Chief Laura Bennett, transformed by the incident, led her department to become a model for reform, auditing past stops and training officers to see people, not profiles. At the National Civil Rights Justice Museum, James's scratched badge rested in a glass case, no nameplate, no explanation, just a card with his handwritten words, "I don't need to be remembered as right, I need to be remembered as the one who didn't look away." Visitors paused before it, not for photos but for reflection, their silence a tribute to a man who'd turned humiliation into a lesson. The plaque at the Willow Creek intersection, now weathered but clear, drew similar pilgrims, students, officers, parents, who stood quietly, asking themselves what justice meant when no one was watching. One spring morning, a young law student visited James's home, seeking answers for a thesis on ethical silence. He found James on the porch, pouring tea, his eyes kind but guarded. "Why didn't you speak out?" the student asked. James set the teapot down, his gaze drifting to the moss-covered bench in the yard, a relic from his mother's early days. "Justice isn't about me," he said softly. "It's about the next person who doesn't have a code to call. If my silence made them see that, then I said enough." The student left, his notebook filled not with quotes but with a new understanding. Justice wasn't a moment of triumph but a daily choice to see others as human. That truth, born from James's restraint, lived on in Alpha Shadow Park, in the training manuals, in the questions children asked their parents. It lived in the way Maya filmed, the way Ethan shared, the way Laura led. It lived in the plaque, the badge, the bench, marks of a man who stood still so a nation could move forward. To everyone who followed James Carter's journey, thank you. You've walked with us through injustice, resilience, and a fight that didn't need a raised voice to be heard. If this story moved you, hit the subscribe button and join us at Revenge Ties, where every tale is a plate of truth, served with heart and hope. Share it, comment, let us know what justice means to you. Keep asking the hard questions, and we'll meet you at the table, where every story builds a new beginning.